All right, I get it. It's been rough. It's been tough to see our Detroit Lions. It's tough to see them lose. It's tough to see Ben Johnson go. It's tough to kind of settle into the offseason with the same amount of excitement as we did last year. But I'm sitting here to tell you why the Detroit Lions have finally received some good news. I got my Detroit Lions hat on. I am ready to go. But let me ask you this. What is your level of confidence heading into next year for this Detroit Lions team? Mine, just as high. Like I am just as confident going into this offseason. In fact, I'm more confident going into this offseason than I was going into last offseason. I'm going to give you some of the reasons for that in this video, but first let me get to some of the good news. Yes, we lost Ben Johnson. The good news is he was here for 3.5 years. He was the sole offensive coordinator for 3 years, and all of the coaches under him were all together. So what that means, very simply put, is that there absolutely is an internal candidate that is ready to replace Ben Johnson. There are a ton. Now, could we look external? Absolutely. But there is an internal candidate. And before I get into a list of 5 or 6 internal candidates, I want to talk about who the offensive coordinator is, and I want to bring in a few different quotes from that as well. But before we get into that, I thought this was funny, so we're going to look at this. Ben Johnson deciding to coach the Bears, me, right? Remember this interview? This is actually Jared Goff doing the interview, and it was just Sonic and Knuckles just sitting there looking at him, being like, what's going on? What's going on, man? You like us or what? And so I'm going to sit here and I'm going to talk about why I think this was always Dan Campbell's offense. Dan Campbell, if you remember, the year after they let go, all right, our offensive coordinator, Anthony Lynn, and they brought in Ben Johnson, we were the coaching staff at the Hershey Senior Bowl, or the Reese's Senior Bowl. And Ben Johnson was calling plays at that Senior Bowl. And Dan Campbell did not commit up until like August, mid-training camp or whatever it was, that Ben Johnson would indeed be calling the plays. He waited all the way until that moment. And if you remember at that time, Dan Campbell was the guy who was calling the plays at the back last like 6 or 7 games of that season. We've talked about this often. This is Dan Campbell's offense. Dan Campbell said recently when talking about replacing coordinators, because he said he hadn't heard, but he had a feeling that both of them were going to go. And here's what he said. He said, the biggest mistake I made was when Anthony Lynn was the offensive coordinator, I was not involved in the offensive game plan heavily. He's like, I will never do that again. He was and has been heavily involved in the offensive game plan ever since. All right, think about it. When you look to the sideline and you see Ben Johnson calling plays and they put a camera on Dan Campbell, what's he looking at? He's looking at an offensive play sheet. When Aaron Glenn's out there calling plays on the defensive side of the ball, Dan Campbell's not looking at anything because Dan Campbell is on this. He is absolutely there in order to call the plays. So even if we don't hire someone to come in and be the offensive coordinator, we will no matter what internally, there is a world in which Dan Campbell calls the plays. Furthermore, let's talk about what Jared Goff said. Jared Goff talked about how I was reading an article on The Athletic before we lost to the Commanders, and he was talking about when things turned the corner for him, when he was talking about when Dan Campbell took over the play calling. He's like, he was always fiery. He was this guy that brought a lot of energy, a good leader, but he was so calm when he was making the play calls. And he's like, that struck me different. I didn't know he had that gear. Dan Campbell already is a built-in offensive coordinator. That's the beauty of this. No matter who is the OC for this team, it will still be Dan Campbell. That's the beauty of this. The only difference between Dan Campbell and Andy Reid and some of these other great offensive minds, you can look at Kevin O'Connell, you can look at Matt LaFleur, you can look at Kyle Shanahan, is that he realizes the role of his head coach and how important that is. So he's going to allow somebody else to be doing the play calling because he just thinks that's a better way to do it. But it doesn't have to stay that way. So let's look at our 5 internal candidates. All right. The first being, if you're not familiar with, running backs coach Scotty Montgomery. Remember, Deuce Staley left. He went to go to Carolina to be closer to his mom. That regime got fired partially through the first year. I think he's with Cleveland now as the running backs coach. But Scotty Montgomery was hired. This is very interesting. All right. When the Lions promoted Johnson to offensive coordinator in 2022, Montgomery, who was with the Colts at the time, was a finalist for the job. When the opportunity came up for the Lions to hire him in 2023, Campbell jumped at it. There was a belief that he was bringing in here to be groomed to be an offensive coordinator. All right. In his current role, he's already developing game plans. He's working with all the players on the roster. Dan Campbell talked about how he's putting them out in front of the team in order to install certain things and plays. And he talked about that there's a number of things that he has developed including running those installs for them. That is a big, big deal. All right. That's name number 1. Name number 2 is the name that everybody loves to talk about because he's the mystery man. All right. And that is Tanner Engstrand. All right. Tanner Engstrand. If you didn't know who he was, you wouldn't know who he was. I think most of us couldn't pick this guy up out of a lineup. I really don't think that we could. And here he is being talked about being our next coach. And what's intriguing to me is even more in the fact that he joined the team in 2020 is this. His first coaching position was a grad assistant under Jim Harbaugh at the University of San Diego, all the way back to 2005. After 12 years there, he rejoined Harbaugh at U of M. He has been on Harbaugh's staff multiple times. Went and spent a season with the DC Defenders, and then was hired by Matt Patricia in Detroit, but Campbell kept him on staff. That is very interesting to me. All right? Here's what Jared Goff had to say about Tanner Engstrand. All right, here's what he said. He said, yeah, Tanner's been awesome, man. Goff said, he's passing game coordinator. PGC is what we call him. He's been great and brings different ideas to Ben, brings different thoughts. I'm able to ask him questions that he can answer instead of hogging Ben down with more. I can kind of go to Tanner with some of that stuff, and he's been extremely helpful for me. I had him in the quarterback room my first year, and he's bounced around this building a couple of times. He's doing a great job. All right, that's number 2. And here's the thing. There's 3 legitimate offensive coordinator candidates. And the next one, I don't think most people do just because of what he is. It is Hank Fraley. He is the offensive lines coach. You have a running backs coach and a passing game coordinator. But now you bring in Hank Fraley, who does the offensive line, and that's kind of more all-encompassing. Does he want to take on that bigger role? And I would say that signs point to, yes, he does. Because with the I don't know why I said that. With the Seattle Seahawks, he has now had not 1, but 2 interviews. Look, we don't want him to go. All right? Lions All-Pro Frank Ragnow said in training camp, and he said it multiple times, just the biggest blessing ever. That is what Hank has been to him. He's a heck of a coach, and the fact that he played center in this league for such a long time has been such a blessing. Look, here's the deal. He said, I've been blessed to have Hank my entire career. Look, Taylor Decker made a plea to retain him, all right, when Dan Campbell was hired. Taylor Decker went straight to him and said, you need to keep Hank here. These guys have talked about if he leaves, they're gone too, right? He doesn't officially have the title of run game coordinator, but he is a huge part. It's kind of attached to him in that way and the rushing game plan. 3 guys that are absolutely there. And then there's 2 other ones. You have Antoine Randall and Mark Brunell. All right, Antoine Randall and Mark Brunell. Antoine Randall is interesting, plays quarterback in college, is a wide receiver at the NFL level, and now he's been coaching for 6 years in the NFL. How we've been able to retain all these guys, I still, for the life of me, can't understand. As our offense has been so good the last 3 years, these 5 guys, right? 4 of the 5 have been here for the entirety of it, and one of them came into it. All right. That's remarkable to me. Randall L's interesting. I'm not sure he'd be ready for that role, but I could easily see Randall L or Mark Brunell if a Tanner Engstrand, if a Montgomery gets the OC role. I could very easily see one of these guys becoming the passing game coordinator to answer those questions and elevate that role. Personally, I like Mark Brunell in that role a little bit more, but I also think he's great just working with Jared Goff. Jared Goff just spoke glowingly about him and the concepts as quarterback coach and the way that he helped. I've never heard Goff talk about Mark Brunell and the X's and O's. I've heard him talk about Tanner in that way. I've never actually heard anybody in the Lions organization talk about Brunell or Randall L with the X's and O's. It's all been the other 3 guys. But here's the thing about Mark Brunell. I didn't realize this. Dude played 19 years. 19 years at quarterback in the NFL. That's nuts to me. All right? He coached high school football for 9 years after playing 19 years before Campbell hired him as a quarterback's coach. So do I think he's probably experienced enough in coaching world? No. But the amount that he played, maybe. And those were really, really good offenses that he absolutely did. So here's my thought process on this. As I'm recording this, it's 4:44. This video will go out at 7 o'clock. Look, I like on the offensive side of the ball keeping it in-house. Because if you keep it in-house, you can promote a bunch of other people. Everybody gets a promotion, and then Ben Johnson's not picking off the staff left and right. On the offensive side of the ball, I want to keep it in-house. On the defensive side of the ball, I would love to jump at the opportunity to get like a Robert Saleh or somebody like that in here. Like we talked about other ones, it looks like Ben Johnson's already going to poach Dennis Allen to go to Chicago. So things like that are obviously real. But yeah, I think on the offensive side of the ball, this is Dan Campbell's baby. And this staff has been, this is arguably, it's not arguably, this is the best offensive staff in the NFL. And so based on what the offense has done, I think that you can't make an argument about that. I would love to have one of these guys, and all of them have been around long enough. Maybe Montgomery's the best for it, but the question is, has he been around long enough in this system to be the best for it? Very intriguing, very interested to see. Also, something to note, Jared Goff is going to get a lot of say in this. Dan Campbell said as much. He said he doesn't want to change the terminology. He doesn't want to change the basis of what they do. So an internal hire might be there, and then they can continue to be creative with those things. Really excited to see what happens on the offensive side of the ball. Most people might not be with me on that. I am. I'm very excited. I think Ben Johnson was right place, right time. I've thought this about him for a really long time, and he can go in there and he's scheming up all these trick plays, and he's mad scientist and all that kind of stuff, but he was in a perfect environment to allow him to use that creativity. I think a lot of very smart minds in the NFL will succeed with the weapons and the offensive line and the head coach that we have at Detroit. I think almost anybody would succeed in that position. So I'm really excited about the offense going forward. All right. Hey, thank you all so much. Thanks for watching. It's all right. We're still good. 15-2. All right. Next year is going to be great. See you in the next one.